I never thought the man who walked me down the aisle at my wedding would one day kick me out of his empire just to put me in my place. My father-in-law didn't just fire me, he humiliated me in front of the entire executive board to prove I was, in his words, just a kid who needed to learn respect. He thought stripping me of everything would crush me. What he didn't know was that I'd rise from the ashes of that meeting and buy out the very company he feared most, turning his biggest nightmare into my full-time job. It happened so fast I almost forgot to be angry. One day I was working 12-hour days in the office he built from scratch, an office I genuinely respected, not just because he ran it, but because it felt like I was building something that would matter one day. My name was on no door, but my fingerprints were on every product we launched. I was the guy behind the scenes, tightening the bolts while the family name took the spotlight. I didn't complain, not once. I understood hierarchy. I understood patience. But apparently what I didn't understand, at least in his eyes, was my place. My name's Carter Langston, and before everything fell apart, I thought I was doing everything right. I married Lily because I loved her, not because her father, Edward Whitmore, ran one of the largest tech consulting firms in the Pacific Northwest. I accepted a job in his company because I believed I could earn my way up like any other employee. And for the first 2 years, that's exactly what I did. I never asked for special treatment. I stayed late, volunteered for the grunt work, and brought in 2 of the company's top 5 contracts during my second year. If anything, I expected the guy to pull me aside and say, "You're proving yourself." Instead, he pulled me into a boardroom full of suits, slid a pink slip across the table, and said, "You're not the kind of man I want near my daughter or my company." Just like that. No warning, no build-up. Just a few sentences about attitude, professionalism, and overstepping my bounds. I remember every word. He said I was arrogant, that I didn't know how to follow, and that maybe if I spent some time out in the real world, I'd learn to appreciate how much he'd tolerated me so far. As if working under his watchful eye was some kind of charity. As if the sleepless nights and the lost weekends didn't count for anything because I didn't share his last name. The worst part wasn't the firing. It wasn't even the look of smug satisfaction on his face when I asked if this was really necessary. It was the silence from Lily. She was there, in the corner of the room, holding her father's coat. She didn't say a word. Didn't look. At me? I don't blame her. She was caught in a storm she didn't start. But it stung. I left the building with nothing but my backpack and my pride, pretending not to notice the stares from the very people I used to collaborate with. I told myself I wouldn't cry. I didn't. But something else broke inside me that day, something harder to describe. The feeling that I was finally part of something meaningful. Gone. I spent the next few weeks floating between coffee shops and job interviews, wondering what the hell just happened. The job offers that came in weren't bad, but they weren't right either. I didn't want to take orders from another boss who saw me as expendable. I wanted something bigger. Not revenge. Not yet. Just freedom. Just something of my own. That's when I remembered a conversation I'd had months before with a senior consultant who used to work for Whitmore's main competitor, Stanton and Royce. He'd left on good terms, but he'd hinted that they were looking to expand into the digital compliance sector, something Whitmore's company had ignored for years. It clicked in my head like a light bulb. I still had contacts. I still had ideas. And I still had the one thing Whitmore never counted on: motivation. I didn't sleep that night. I called in every favor I could think of. Old clients, former interns, colleagues who'd left under quieter circumstances. I wasn't pitching them revenge. I was pitching them vision. A leaner, sharper, more responsive company that didn't sit on legacy, but sprinted toward innovation. They listened. Some invested. Some offered desk space, legal guidance, even marketing connections. I pieced together the bones of a company from the scraps they left behind. But that's a story for later. Right now, I want you to understand this. Getting fired was the best thing that ever happened to me. Not because it hurt, it did, but because it made me dangerous. It made me hungry. And when you've been underestimated your entire life, there's something poetic about coming back with receipts. My father-in-law thought he was teaching me a lesson, and he did, just not the one he intended. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Before all of this, before the boardroom ambush, before the silence from Lily, before I turned the industry on its head, I was just another guy trying to fit in. My name never carried weight. I didn't come from old money or a legacy of business. Moguls. I came from a middle-class suburb in Colorado, where people measured success by the size of your backyard barbecue and whether your snowblower worked before the first storm hit. My dad was a high school teacher. My mom, a nurse. They believed in hard work, not shortcuts. That's the kind of house I was raised in. I met Lily in grad school. She was the kind of woman who walked into a room and made everyone else feel like they'd forgotten how to dress. Not in a showy way, but with this effortless polish that came from being born into a world where nothing was ever just good. Enough. She wasn't arrogant. She wasn't shallow. She was just composed. Smart, too. The kind of smart that didn't need to prove anything. And maybe that's what drew me in. I was a guy trying to prove I belonged. She already knew she did. We met at a marketing seminar and clicked immediately. She asked real questions. She listened. And she didn't flinch when I told her I worked nights at a logistics warehouse to pay for tuition. Most people would nod, politely, and move on. She wanted to know what I liked about it. That's who she was. Curious, sincere, and always willing to see beyond the surface. When we started dating, I didn't know her last name meant something. I didn't Google her. I didn't connect the dots until 6 months in when she invited me to dinner at her parents' estate. Estate, not house. The kind of place with hedges so precisely trimmed they looked like green marble. That was the first night I met Edward Whitmore. I'll never forget his handshake. Firm, dry, and about 1 second too long. The kind of grip that's more of a silent challenge than a greeting. His smile didn't reach his eyes. He was cordial, yes. But I could feel it in the way he sized me up. The way he asked where I was from, what my father did, where I saw myself. In 10 years, they weren't small talk questions. They were assessments. Lily warned me beforehand. He's old school, she said. He believes men should make their own way. I didn't think much of it at the time. I figured, great. So, he didn't say much that first night. But I remember one comment in particular. When I told him I was finishing my MBA and focusing on digital strategy for small to mid-sized firms, he paused, tilted his glass of scotch, and said, "So, not going into anything serious then?" That was his way of dismissing what I did. That was the moment I realized who I was really dealing with. Still, I didn't let it get to me. I loved Lily, and she loved me. That was enough. Over time, he warmed up, or at least pretended to. When we got engaged, he didn't object. When I offered to pay for part of the wedding, he declined with a chuckle and a pat on the back. "You just focus on being a good husband," he said. "Leave the finances to the grown-ups." It was a joke, but it didn't feel like one. The job offer came a few months after the honeymoon. He said they were expanding their digital arm and thought I might be a decent fit if I could keep up. It wasn't an enthusiastic endorsement, but I took it. Not because I needed a handout, but because I saw an opportunity to prove myself, not just to him, but to myself. I believed I could earn his respect. At first, it felt like I was getting somewhere. I was hired as a strategy associate, reporting to a guy named Martin who clearly didn't want me there. Whether he resented my connection to the boss or just thought I was too young, I never knew. But I worked harder than anyone else on my floor. I showed up before sunrise, left after everyone else, and made sure no one could ever accuse me of coasting. I brought in new software recommendations, streamlined their outdated client onboarding system, and even identified a major leak in one of their high-value accounts. I wasn't just competent. I was contributing real value. But here's the thing about legacy companies. Results aren't everything. Relationships, bloodlines, unspoken hierarchies, they matter more. Edward saw my success as lucky. Or worse, threatening. The more I grew in the company, the more his behavior shifted. He started inviting me to fewer meetings. My ideas were put on hold or deferred for further discussion. And when I landed a $7 million contract through a cold lead I'd cultivated for months, the credit was rerouted to someone else in the press release. I didn't complain. I thought, if I just keep doing the work, the results will speak for themselves. But I was wrong. It wasn't about the work. It never was. What I didn't realize back then was that Edward Whitmore wasn't just a CEO. He was a king in his own castle. And in his eyes, I wasn't a prince. I was an outsider. A skilled worker. Maybe, but not royalty. Not someone who belonged at the round table. Looking back, all the signs were there. The passive-aggressive comments. The backhanded praise. The private meetings I wasn't invited to, even though the topics directly involved my work. He was slowly boxing me out, and I kept hoping that if I worked harder, if I played it right, he'd eventually let me in. He never did, because his mind was made up before I ever walked through that door. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It's strange how tension creeps in like a slow leak. At first, it's subtle. You don't notice anything major, just the faint sense that something's off. But eventually, that leak turns into a flood. That's how it felt working at Whitmore. Industries. I wasn't just navigating a company anymore. I was walking a tightrope inside my own family. The first real shift came after the regional pitch. I had been spearheading a new logistics optimization plan that was projected to save the company over $2.5 million annually. It was innovative, scalable, and backed by real data. I spent weeks preparing, refining every slide, every talking point. The boardroom was full that day. Regional directors, senior VPs, and of course, Edward at the head of the table, sipping his usual black coffee like a judge presiding over trial. I crushed the presentation. I knew I did. People nodded. One of the VPs even clapped when I broke down the projected margins. But when I finished and sat down, Edward cleared his throat and said, "It's an interesting idea. A bit ambitious, perhaps. Let's circle back on it next quarter." That was code for, "It's going in the trash." No one questioned him. Not even Martin, who had praised the model 2 days earlier in a private meeting. It was like the oxygen left the room. I felt humiliated, not just ignored. From that day on, I noticed a shift, not just from Edward, but from everyone else too. People stopped looping me in on key initiatives. My name was mysteriously missing from email threads. When clients called asking for me directly, they were told I was tied up with internal operations. Lies. All of it. At home, it got worse. Lily and I were still solid, but she started to notice the change in me. I was quiet, distracted, tired. And when she asked what was going on at work, I didn't want to answer. How do you tell the woman you love that her father is systematically trying to destroy your credibility? At first, I deflected. Just a lot on my plate, I'd say. But one night, after Edward canceled a dinner meeting I was supposed to attend, without telling me, I finally told her. I think your dad wants me gone, I said flatly. She blinked. What? Why would he? I don't know, I replied. Maybe I've outstayed my welcome. Maybe I was never welcome. She tried to defend him at first. He's just tough on everyone. He sees potential in you, Carter. That's why. He challenges you. But even she didn't sound convinced. Deep down, she knew something was off too. The real turning point came during the acquisition project. A smaller logistics firm, Hawthorne and Finch, was up for grabs. They were tech-driven, lean and highly profitable in urban markets we were struggling to penetrate. I was tasked with initial research, but after submitting my strategy memo, I was suddenly pulled off the project. No explanation. Just an email from HR saying the acquisition team was being restructured. A week later, Martin was leading the charge, and my memo had been white-labeled under his name. Word for word. That was it for me. The gloves came off. I stopped trying to prove anything. Instead, I started watching, listening, documenting. If Edward wanted me to play this game, fine, but I'd play it on my terms. I began keeping track of every instance where my work was appropriated. I downloaded time-stamped files, created backup logs, and even began forwarding important communications to a secure personal folder. I wasn't planning anything malicious. I just wanted proof. Proof that I wasn't crazy. That the man who smiled at me across the Thanksgiving table was the same man systematically eroding my role at his company. At the same time, Edward's jabs became less subtle. He stopped inviting me to monthly board dinners. During a company retreat, he introduced Lily to the senior staff, but conveniently left me out. "This is my daughter, Lily," he said proudly. "She's married now, to someone in marketing." I think? Someone in marketing. It was meant to sting, and it did. Still, I stayed. Not because I was weak, but because I was watching. And I was learning. Every move they made, every file they shared, every acquisition they whispered about, I studied it all. Because a storm was coming, and I needed to be ready. Then came the gala. Whitmore Industries was celebrating its 40th year, and Edward, of course, was being honored. He gave a speech about legacy, about vision, about building something that lasts. I stood at the edge of the ballroom with a glass of champagne and watched the crowd eat it up. And then he spotted me. He walked over, drink in hand, and with a smirk said, "Carter, glad you could make it." "I thought you might have been too busy updating spreadsheets," I smiled back. "Wouldn't miss it. Legacy is everything, right?" He chuckled and leaned in. "Legacy is earned, not inherited. Something to keep in mind." That night, I made my decision. I wasn't going to stay and be someone's puppet or someone's project. I wasn't going to fight for scraps while being paraded like an accessory. No more playing nice. I would walk away, but not quietly, not empty-handed, and definitely not without a plan. When you're pushed far enough, there's a moment where something inside you snaps. Not with anger, at least not the kind that yells or punches walls. It's quieter, like steel freezing over. That's what happened to me one Thursday morning. 2 weeks after the gala, I was called into Edward's office at 9 a.m. sharp. That wasn't unusual. He had a way of summoning people like royalty requesting a servant's presence. I walked in expecting another round of passive-aggressive critique or maybe a fake compliment laced with belittlement. But the atmosphere was different this time. Martin was already there, sitting stiffly in one of the leather chairs. An HR rep stood awkwardly near the window pretending to check her tablet. Edward didn't even offer me a seat. "Carter," he began, standing behind his desk, arms folded. "We've reviewed your recent performance, and we've come to a difficult conclusion." I blinked. "Excuse me?" "You're being relieved of your responsibilities, effective immediately." My brain stalled. "Wait. Fired?" He nodded, cool as ever. "Let go. Terminated. However you want to word it." Martin wouldn't even look at me. For what? I asked, trying to stay calm. Edward walked around the desk, now towering just a foot away. You've been distracted, unfocused. You've failed to deliver on key initiatives and created tension among senior staff. This isn't personal, Carter. It's business. I almost laughed. Not personal? You're firing your son-in-law and pretending it's just a quarterly performance review? He shrugged. Sometimes hard decisions are necessary to maintain order. And then came the final blow. I want you to understand something, he added, voice suddenly colder. This isn't about failure. It's about respect. You came into my company thinking you were owed something. You've forgotten your place. Maybe a season outside this office will teach you the humility you clearly lack. That was it. He wasn't just firing me. He was trying to break me. They handed me a pre-written termination letter and a generic severance package. The HR rep, still avoiding eye contact, offered to walk me out. I declined. I wasn't about to be paraded like some criminal. I cleared out my office in under 20 minutes. No tears, no scene, just a deep, burning cold in my chest. I texted Lily one sentence. I've been fired. I'll explain later. Then I walked out of Whitmore Industries, out of that glass tower with my name still on a parking spot in the garage, out of the legacy I was supposed to help build, out of the shadow of a man who had made it his mission to belittle me until I either quit or collapsed. But I didn't collapse, because something inside me had been quietly preparing for this exact moment. That night, I sat on the floor of our apartment, laptop open, notes spread out like a blueprint for vengeance, not the dramatic kind. No revenge plots, no smear campaigns, just strategy, precision. You see, Edward thought he had all the power. What he didn't know was that in trying to teach me respect, he'd taught me everything I needed to beat him at his own game. Months ago, during my time at Whitmore, I'd quietly built contacts in the logistics and supply chain industry. Competitors, suppliers, analysts, and yes, some very unhappy former Whitmore clients who didn't like the company's stagnant strategies or Edward's outdated arrogance. One name kept coming up during those conversations: Crossline Freight. They were small, but sharp, based in Denver. Run by a quiet genius named Carla Kim. She had bootstrapped the company from a single truck to a nationwide operation with cutting-edge AI-based route planning. Edward had mocked them, called them a tech toy wrapped in a trucker's fantasy, but I saw what he didn't. Crossline was agile, growing fast, and stealing market share from right under Whitmore's nose, and they were looking for an investor. I reached out. Carla remembered me from a conference where I had complimented her work, while everyone else dismissed her as too experimental. She agreed to meet. Over coffee, I shared my vision, not just for investment, but for transformation. I knew Whitmore's weak spots. I knew their supply chain gaps, their bloated costs, their lazy leadership. I offered more than capital. I offered intel. Carla didn't hesitate. We partnered. She brought the tech and the people. I brought the connections and a list of clients ready to jump ship the moment Whitmore fumbled again. But we needed more than a slow burn. We needed impact. So, I took a risk. I reached out to 5 of Whitmore's biggest clients, ones I had personally worked with, ones who trusted me. I told them the truth, that I was starting something smarter, leaner, faster. And that if they wanted to stay ahead of the curve, they'd want to hear me out. 3 of them agreed to pilot contracts. One of them flat out told me, "We only stayed with Whitmore out of habit. If you're building something better, we're in." It was happening. It was actually happening. The man who fired me to teach me respect had no idea he had just cleared the runway for me to take off. Lily, for her part, was shocked at first, but supportive. She stood by me. She didn't defend her father anymore. She just asked, "What's your plan?" I told her, "To win, quietly, then loudly." And that's exactly what I started to do. Starting a company sounds glamorous. Startup culture, independence, big dreams. But the truth? It's long nights, mounting doubts, and working with nothing but sheer belief. That's where I was. On the 12th floor of a co-working space that smelled like burnt coffee and desperation, armed with a refurbished laptop, a few loyal connections, and a fire I hadn't felt in years. Carla and I decided to call the venture Nova Hall Logistics. She came up with the name. It meant New Hall, a nod to both the trucking industry and the idea of a fresh start. I liked that. We weren't just building a competitor to Whitmore. We were building something modern, ethical, and agile, everything that Edward's company wasn't. The first order of business was setting up our infrastructure. Carla handled the tech side like a wizard. She custom-built an internal dashboard that tracked freight, optimized fuel consumption, predicted delays, and even integrated customer feedback in real time. I focused on the operational and sales strategy. We didn't have a giant fleet or a vast office, but what we had was momentum. That momentum really kicked in the day one of our 3 pilot clients gave us their first full regional contract. They needed a fleet to handle multi-state distribution from Austin to Atlanta. It was a bold leap, too bold, honestly, but Carla and I decided to take it. We rented trucks, hired 3 veteran drivers through her network, and put every dollar of our modest investment into that first job. It wasn't smooth. One of our rented rigs broke down halfway through Alabama. A winter storm delayed a delivery by 2 days. But the difference was in how we responded. I personally updated the client every 3 hours, rerouted a backup truck using Carla's AI, and got the order there with only a slight delay. The client's manager called me afterward and said, "I've never had someone this responsive in logistics. You made a fan out of me." That's when I knew we were onto something. Our second big break came from a warehouse chain in Nevada that had worked with Whitmore for years. I'd sat in on calls with them dozens of times, always saw the dissatisfaction in their eyes when Whitmore's executives brushed off their needs. So I sent a simple email. "If you're still open to smarter service and clearer communication, I'd love to talk." They replied the same day. 2 weeks later, Nova Hall signed a 6-month contract that doubled our operations. It wasn't all wins, though. There were nights when I wondered if I'd made a mistake, if I should have swallowed my pride and asked Edward for forgiveness. But then I'd remember that office, that smug voice telling me I needed to be taught respect. And every time, that memory fueled another pitch, another call, another late-night email that brought us one step closer to legitimacy. Meanwhile, word started getting out. I began to notice a shift. Former co-workers from Whitmore, some in logistics, some in finance, reached out privately. They weren't thrilled with the company's direction under Martin. Many felt stifled, unheard, even fearful. One guy, Jason from procurement, messaged me saying, "You don't know how lucky you are to be out." Lucky wasn't the word I would have chosen, but I got what he meant. By month 6, Nova Hall had 9 contracts and a reliable rotation of drivers. We upgraded from our co-working office to a real headquarters, still modest, but it had a proper reception area, real conference rooms, and most importantly, a sense of home. I made it a point to run things differently. No fear-based leadership. No glass walls that separated executives from the rest. Every Friday, I sat in the break room with the drivers and staff just to hear what was working and what wasn't. Then came the press. A mid-level industry blog ran a piece titled, "The Startup That's Stealing Whitmore's Thunder?" I didn't expect it to blow up, but it did. Our phones started ringing. My LinkedIn flooded. Investors started poking around. And with that came something else I hadn't prepared for: Edward's attention. I got the first sign in the form of a text from Lily. "Dad asked if you're involved with Nova Hall." I didn't answer. I stared at my phone for a minute. So, he finally noticed. It was almost poetic. The man who thought I wasn't worth keeping in his company was now watching the company I built start circling his market share like a hawk. But I wasn't done yet. Because I had a bigger plan in mind. One that would take more than contracts and clients. I wanted to do what no one thought I could do, dominate the space he'd ruled for decades, and buy the one company he was terrified of losing ground to. Crosslink Transport, the only logistics firm that Whitmore had failed to acquire 5 years ago. They were massive, private, and powerful. But I had something they didn't: agility, fresh tech, and the client loyalty that came from being human, not robotic. I set my sights high. I'd build Nova Hall not just as a rival, but as the firm that would eventually make Crosslink see us as a worthy merger. And once we did that, Edward wouldn't just lose business. He'd lose the very seat he built his empire on, because I wasn't just coming back into the industry. I was coming back with the leverage to reshape it. By the time our second year rolled in, Nova Hall Logistics wasn't just a name on paper. We were booking full loads across multiple states, averaging a 98% on-time delivery rate, and our clients didn't just like us, they trusted us. And in an industry where timing is money and reliability is king, trust was everything. But with success comes visibility, and with visibility comes heat. The first crack came from inside Whitmore's fortress. A friend of mine, Caleb, who still worked there in mid-level management, called me one afternoon out of the blue. He sounded nervous, like he was looking over his shoulder while talking. "Carter," he said, "they had a board meeting this morning. Your name came up 3 times. I chuckled. Good things, I hope? Depends. Edward's not just annoyed anymore. He's worried. You've snatched 2 of their oldest clients in 6 months. Martin's scrambling, and rumor has it Edward thinks you're doing it to embarrass him." I paused, leaning back in my chair. "I'm not doing it to embarrass anyone," I said. "I'm just doing better business." Caleb lowered his voice. "That's exactly why it's embarrassing." That moment hit me hard. Not because I was afraid of Edward. I had moved far past that fear. But because it confirmed what I had suspected all along. He'd never expected me to rise. He thought firing me would send me spiraling, or at best crawling back. But the only thing it did was awaken a side of me that he never allowed to breathe. Now that side was reshaping the landscape he had ruled for 30 years. A week later, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was Edward's assistant. She said he wanted to meet, not at Whitmore's headquarters, at a hotel lounge downtown. "Just to talk," she said. I hesitated, but eventually agreed. Carla wasn't thrilled. "You know what he's like." "What? If it's some trap or a buyout ploy?" But I needed to see him face to face, not to settle a score, but to measure the man who once controlled my future and now wanted a meeting on neutral ground. When I walked into the lounge, he was already there sipping coffee. Same tailored suit, same polished shoes, same cold, calculating expression. But something about him looked smaller, like the shine had dulled just a bit. "Carter," he nodded, motioning to the seat across from him. "You've made quite a splash." I sat. That's what happens when you let people grow. He ignored the jab. "I didn't expect you to go into logistics." "Why not? I learned from the best, right?" I let the silence sit for a beat. "So, why'd you call? Me here?" He cleared his throat. "I wanted to make you an offer. You've proven yourself. I can see that now. And while our past had its friction, I think we can move forward professionally." I leaned in slightly. "What are you offering?" "A partnership," he said, adjusting his cufflink. "Whitmore has infrastructure. You have energy and innovation. We could form a joint brand, combine contracts, share fleets, take on Crosslink together." I stared at him. The same man who had publicly fired me in front of his boardroom just 2 years ago was now extending an olive branch because I had built something he didn't see coming. You taught me a valuable lesson, Edward, I said slowly. But not the one you intended. You taught me that some people only respect results, not character. And the moment you saw me as a threat instead of family, you lost both. His face tensed. You'd be wise to think about this offer. I already have, I replied, and it's a no. I stood up, left the hotel, and never looked back. After that meeting, the temperature rose fast. I heard from 2 clients that Whitmore was undercutting bids just to win back accounts. One even said they were offered 3 months of service at cost, just to get them to leave Novahall. But none of them did. Because unlike Whitmore, we didn't treat people like numbers. We didn't deliver just freight. We delivered consistency, communication, and care. But what really shook Edward's empire came a month later, when Crosslink Transport called me. Yes, the same Crosslink that had refused to be acquired by Whitmore years ago. The same Crosslink that Edward had tried to woo with flashy presentations and legacy branding. They weren't calling to compete. They were calling to talk partnership with us. Apparently, they had taken notice of Novahall's growth. More importantly, they admired our tech stack. Carla's dashboard had become the talk of the regional carriers. Their operations manager told me, "You're leaner, faster, and more adaptable than anyone else we've dealt with. We want in." We set a meeting. This time, not at a lounge, but in a glass tower overlooking the skyline. Novahall was now on the table not as a startup, but as a future power player. Carla and I sat across from 4 Crosslink executives, walked them through our vision, and by the end of the meeting, their CFO said, "We don't want to acquire you. We want to grow with you. Equal stakes, equal say." It wasn't just a deal, it was validation. We signed an agreement 2 weeks later. Novahall and Crosslink became Novalink Logistics, a joint venture with real muscle, real reach, and the kind of leadership Whitmore could never match. The day that merger hit the industry news, I got one last text from Lily. Just one word. Wow. But I wasn't finished, because now that we had scale, capital, and the loyalty of key clients, I was ready to pull the final card. The one move Edward never saw coming. The one that would force him to watch, powerless, as everything he built got overtaken by the man he fired to teach him respect. By the time Novalink was officially launched, we were no longer the underdogs. Between Crosslink's massive logistics network and our client-first systems, we had become a serious contender in the freight game. But for me, it wasn't just about market share or climbing charts. It was about closure. Edward Whitmore had built a business on hierarchy, intimidation, and tradition. I had built mine on innovation, partnership, and trust. And now, after years of trying to prove my worth in his world, I was ready to redefine it. I began putting together what I quietly called the takeover blueprint, a multi-phase strategy that would give us a dominant edge in Edward's core territories, ultimately choking his operation where it mattered most, his cash flow and contracts. I started by identifying his 5 highest-paying legacy contracts. These weren't just clients. They were symbols of prestige, some dating back 20 years. And they were all vulnerable in one way or another. Delayed shipments, communication gaps, inflated billing. I sent a small but sharp team from Novalink to quietly meet with each of these companies. Not with sales pitches, but with real-time data showing them where Whitmore was failing and how we could do it better, cheaper, and faster. We offered 30-day trials with performance metrics built in. Nothing shady, no poaching, just facts. By the end of the second month, we had secured 3 of those 5 contracts. Edward's office must have been in chaos. I didn't need to hear it. I could feel it in how fast his people started reacting. Clients reported being begged to stay with rate cuts, bonuses, and in some cases, straight-up guilt trips. But it was too late. One of those contracts, ironically, was with Kestrel Automotive, the same client whose account I had helped double during my first year working under Edward. The same account he told me I wasn't ready to lead. Kestrel's head of logistics told me during a call, "We always liked you, Carter. Honestly, we were shocked when you disappeared from meetings. The moment you launched your own thing, we were hoping you'd reach out." It was surreal. The same doors that were once bolted shut were now swinging open. Meanwhile, Carla had been busy analyzing Whitmore's internal logistics. "I think they're bleeding from the inside," she told me one morning. "Employee turnover's up 22%, morale's down. They're operating with outdated software and overworked dispatchers." She was right. Edward's company was cracking, not from one blow, but from years of inflexible leadership finally catching up to him. I didn't gloat. I didn't throw a press release party. But I did get even more focused. Because the next phase of the blueprint was bold: acquisition. One of Whitmore's regional carriers, Northspire Freight, was a mid-sized subsidiary quietly doing most of their West Coast deliveries. We discovered they hadn't been paid bonuses in 3 quarters, and the owner was already shopping around for exit opportunities. He didn't want to sell to a megacorp. He wanted someone who'd take care of his team. So I flew out, met him in person, and laid everything out. "I'm not here to gut your company or rename your fleet. I'm here to make you part of something that's actually moving forward. Your people matter. Your legacy matters. Let's grow together." He shook my hand. 30 days later, Novalink closed the deal. That acquisition sent a message loud and clear to everyone in the industry. Whitmore Logistics was no longer untouchable. It was aging, stiff, outpaced. When Edward finally reached out again, it wasn't. Through his assistant, he emailed me directly. Subject: enough. Message: you've made your point. Can we talk? I stared at that email for a full minute before typing a reply. Subject: sure. Message: your office or mine? We met at Novalink HQ this time. Carla insisted on sitting in. I told her it wasn't necessary, but she said, "If he's coming into our house, I want to hear how he talks to you now." Edward walked in wearing his usual sharp suit, but the weight in his eyes gave him away. He looked older, not just in years, but in the way someone looks when they've realized the world moved on without them. He didn't waste time. "You've taken nearly a third of our accounts," he said, not angrily, just plainly. "You've embarrassed me." I didn't flinch. "No. I've done what I always wanted to do, build something that worked. I just stopped doing it under your thumb." He looked at Carla, then back at me. "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" "Before starting all of this," I laughed, quietly. "You fired me, Edward, remember? Not just from your company, but from your family. You made that decision. Not me." He didn't respond right away. Just sat there. Then he finally asked the question I hadn't expected. "What do you want?" I leaned forward. "I want to buy Whitmore." The words just hung there. For the first time since I met the man, Edward looked genuinely speechless. I continued. "Not to dismantle it, not for revenge, but because it deserves better leadership. Your people deserve someone who believes in them, who adapts, who listens." His jaw tightened. "You think I'd sell my life's work to the man I fired?" I nodded. "It's either that or watch it slowly fade into irrelevance. I'm giving you an exit. Clean, dignified." He stood up. "We're done here." I let him walk out without a word, because I knew he'd be back, and when he did, I'd be ready. 3 weeks went by, not a word from Edward. I wasn't surprised. A man like him doesn't retreat easily. He'd built his identity on dominance, tradition, and control. Admitting defeat, especially to someone he once saw as an expendable kid, wasn't in his nature. But I also knew men like him didn't ignore numbers, and the numbers were brutal. Whitmore Logistics was hemorrhaging. Word from our former colleagues inside said that 3 long-term clients had terminated their contracts. 2 major regional managers left for Novalink, and morale? Non-existent. The company was cracking under the weight of its pride. I had expected a response, an aggressive one even, but what I got instead was an email, short, polite, too polite, in fact. Subject, open to negotiation. Message, I've thought about your offer. I'm willing to talk, privately. No dramatic apology, no acknowledgement of the months of disrespect. Just a simple white flag. I read it 3 times before leaning back in my chair. Carla was standing nearby, her phone in hand. She must have noticed the shift in my expression. Is that him? She asked. Yep. And? He's ready. Her smirk spread slowly. Now this is where things get fun. I met Edward at the Rutherford Hills Golf Club, his usual haunt. The kind of place where you need a collared shirt just to park. Old white money was baked into the architecture. Dark wood, oil paintings of people you're expected to know, and waiters who somehow made you feel underdressed even in a tailored suit. He greeted me at the entrance to the private lounge. He looked older than I remembered. Not in years, but in weight, like the stress of losing control had carved itself into his posture. No entourage today, he said. No audience, I replied. You asked for this to be private. He nodded and gestured toward a leather booth. We sat, and he wasted no time. Let's not pretend this is a friendly catch-up. I know why we're here. Then let's not waste time, I said, matching his tone. You want to sell. I want to buy. He leaned forward, elbows on the table. I'm not desperate, Carter. Don't mistake this conversation for weakness. I don't, I said. Calmly. I see it for what it is. Realism. The industry's changed and your company hasn't. You know it. Your board knows it. And your clients definitely know it. He didn't argue. Instead, he reached into his briefcase and slid over a manila folder. I opened it. Detailed valuation, terms, and a breakdown of assets. You'll find the price fair, he said. But I want conditions. You don't get to raise the place to the ground and plant your name over it. This company is a legacy, my father's and mine. I want it respected. I studied him for a moment. This wasn't about money for him. Not really. This was about history. About being remembered. About proving that even in defeat he had control over how the story ended. That's fair, I said. Here's what I'll offer. The Whitmore brand will stay operational in select regions where it still holds weight. We'll retain your legacy teams. No mass firings, no shutdowns. He nodded slightly. But, I added, I have conditions. 2. His eyes narrowed. Go on. You endorse this merger? Publicly. I don't just want a press release written by lawyers. I want a statement from you, on record, saying you trust me to lead, that I've earned this. His face tightened. That's not a business term, that's personal. Exactly, I said. Because what you did to me wasn't business, it was personal. You tried to humiliate me, tried to teach me a lesson in respect. Now I'm asking you to show. He was silent for a long time, the kind of silence that feels like a test, a power play. Then he let out a long breath and sat back. You've changed. No, I said evenly. You just never looked close enough. That line landed. His expression softened. Just a little. I'll do it, he said finally. You get the company, I get to walk out with dignity. And yes, I'll give you your statement. We shook hands across the table. It felt surreal. The same hand that once signed my termination letter was now sealing a deal that would put his company under my control. Within a week, the acquisition was finalized. Carla handled the logistics with the kind of precision that made me grateful, again, that she'd stuck with me. The announcement went out the following Monday. Edward's statement made headlines in every major logistics journal. After decades of building Whitmore Logistics into an industry leader, I'm proud to pass the baton to someone who represents the future, Carter Blake. His innovation, leadership, and relentless pursuit of excellence have earned my trust. It was the most praise I'd ever heard him give anyone. I'd be lying if I said it didn't feel good. Internally, we held a small team event. Carla surprised me with a cake that said, "Respect earned," in giant red frosting letters. Everyone laughed. Someone joked about printing it on company shirts. I didn't laugh, though. I just stood there, taking it all in, because for the first time since being fired, I felt still, at peace. Not because I'd won, but because I had taken control of my narrative. I didn't burn Whitmore down. I built something better. And I did it without compromising who I was. Edward kept his seat, on the board. True to his word, he never interfered. Over time, I think he even started to admire what we were doing. Occasionally, he'd send a note of feedback. Not always flattering, but never unfair. That was enough for me. I hadn't just taken over his company, I'd taken back my voice. After the acquisition was complete and the headlines faded, life took on a new rhythm, a calmer one. But that calm didn't come from success. It came from the healing that followed. For the first time in years, I wasn't fighting to prove my worth. I wasn't dodging insults or scrambling to be seen. I had earned not just the position, but the peace that came with it. But there was still one part of my life that needed repair. Sarah. My wife had stood by me through the storm, even when it was her father who created the hurricane. She didn't pick sides. She stood in the middle, trying to hold both worlds together with nothing but love and prayer. And now that the dust had settled, it was time I made space to see her fully again. Not as the daughter of the man who fired me, not as the woman who cried in the dark when her family splintered, but as my partner, my anchor. I took her away for a weekend. Just us. No business calls. No emails. We went to a quiet cabin by Lake Mendora, a place we'd talked about visiting for years but never made time for. The lake was still. The silence was healing. The first night we didn't talk about the company. We just sat by the fire, sipping wine, listening to old jazz songs she loved. "Feels like we finally came up for air," she said, curling into my side. "Yeah," I said, and I forgot how much I missed breathing. She looked up at me. "You did it, Carter." "We did," I corrected. "You were in every step of it." She smiled, but I could still see the sadness in her eyes. "Do you think he hates me for siding with you?" she asked softly. I shook my head. "No. I think he respects you more than he ever expected to." And that was true. Edward never said it out loud, but in the boardroom after the deal, he had paused, looked at me and said, "You chose a good partner. She has more backbone than most men I know." That's how he showed love, in strange, sideways compliments. The second day of the trip, Sarah handed me something unexpected, a leather-bound notebook. "What's this?" I asked. I started writing it during the worst of everything. It's a mix of journal entries and prayers, things I was too afraid to say out loud at the time. I opened it gently. Page 1 had one sentence. "Please, God, don't let this fight break us." The pages that followed were raw, painful, and beautiful. Her words bled with fear, with strength, and with hope. She had been carrying a storm inside her while holding me steady through mine. That night, I cried, for the first time in years, not because I was broken, but because I was finally safe enough to feel again. When we returned home, I stepped into leadership at Novalink not just as a CEO, but as a man reborn. I changed the culture. Meetings began with listening sessions. I built a mentorship program for young professionals, especially those without traditional degrees or family connections. People like me. One of our interns, Reggie, reminded me of myself at 22. Hungry, humble, and invisible in a room full of suits. I took him under my wing, gave him real projects, not just coffee runs. A few months later, he led a client presentation that landed us a major account. You changed my life, he told me after. I shook my head. You were already changing it. I just made sure you were seen. It became my mission to make sure no one in the company ever felt like I once did. Small, replaceable, unheard. Even Carla, my ever-brilliant operations director, began speaking at leadership conferences. I nominated her for an industry award, and she won. Watching her shine felt better than winning anything for myself. Edward remained on the board. True to his word, he didn't interfere. But slowly, he began showing up more, asking questions, offering insights. He and I would grab coffee occasionally, awkward at first, then surprisingly easy. One afternoon, he invited me to his house. Not for business, just dinner. Sarah was there, of course. So was her mother. It felt normal. Not perfect, not fully healed, but human. After dinner, Edward pulled me aside. You know, he said, staring at an old photo on the mantel. When I fired you, I really did think I was teaching you something. About humility. About strength. I said nothing. I wanted to hear him out. But the truth is, he continued, I was scared. Scared of someone smarter, hungrier. Someone who didn't grow up with everything handed to them. You threatened. What I thought leadership looked like. He turned to me. I was wrong. Those 3 words felt heavier than the entire merger agreement. I nodded. Took me a while to understand that, too. We stood in silence. Not as enemies. Not even as family. Just as 2 men who'd survived each other's storms and were still standing. Later that week, I wrote something on a sticky note and placed it on my office monitor. Don't just build a legacy. Break the cycles that kept others out. It reminded me every day why I was doing this. The story wasn't just about revenge or redemption. It was about restoring what was broken, starting with myself. A full year had passed since the day I sealed the deal to acquire Novalink, the company that had once been my father-in-law's rival. So much had changed, not just on paper, but in the way I lived, led, and looked at the world around me. Looking back now, it's almost hard to believe how much those 12 months reshaped everything I thought I knew about success, respect, and family. The office atmosphere was unrecognizable from the tense, cutthroat environment I had entered years ago. I used to think leadership meant asserting dominance, being the loudest voice in the room, the one who never showed weakness or doubt. But the lessons from that painful past year taught me otherwise. True leadership, I discovered, comes from empathy, from listening with intent, from building bridges where there were once walls. One of the first big changes I implemented was what we called Open Door Thursdays. Every Thursday afternoon, my office door literally stayed open, inviting anyone from junior interns to senior managers to come in, speak freely, ask questions, or share ideas, no matter how small or grand. At first, the turnout was modest, but slowly, the space filled with laughter, debates, honest conversations, and sometimes even tears. It was remarkable to see the transformation, not just in the company culture, but in the people themselves. Jessica, one of our new hires, told me during one of those sessions, "This is the first time I feel heard at a job." She had struggled to find her footing when she joined, but was now leading a project team with confidence. Moments like these were my fuel. They reminded me why I'd fought so hard, not just for myself, but for everyone who ever felt invisible or undervalued. Despite the progress, it wasn't a perfect journey. I still faced challenges, some external, some deeply personal. My relationship with Edward, my father-in-law, remained complicated. While the old wounds hadn't fully healed, they no longer bled as openly. We had awkward moments. He sometimes questioned decisions, voiced doubts about my style, or fell back into old ways of thinking. But beneath the surface, there was a grudging respect and, surprisingly, a willingness to listen. One afternoon, After a particularly tough board meeting where Edward challenged a new employee development initiative I'd championed, I found him lingering in the conference room. He looked at me and said, "You've changed the game, Carter. I might not always understand your methods, but I can't deny the results." I nodded slowly, the words feeling heavier than any praise he had ever given. It was a quiet truce, a beginning, perhaps, of something new. At home, Sarah and I were rebuilding too. Those early days after the firing were raw, filled with awkward silences and unspoken resentments. But over time, we found our way back to each other, deeper and more resilient than before. We no longer saw ourselves as victims or casualties of Edward's harsh lesson, but as partners in life and work. One night, over dinner, Sarah shared her fears about her father's legacy, how she worried she'd forever be caught between two worlds, neither fully hers. I took her hand and told her, "We're not defined by the past. We're the authors of our own story now." Together, we started volunteering at a local nonprofit that focused on mentoring at-risk youth, kids who, like me once, felt like the world had written them off. Giving back grounded us, reminding us of what truly mattered beyond balance sheets and profit margins. Personally, the past year forced me to confront my own flaws. I realized how much pride had blinded me. I had equated respect with fear, leadership with control, success with status. But those things I learned were hollow without integrity, humility, and heart. There were nights I lay awake thinking about the young man I used to be, eager, uncertain, desperate to prove his worth. The man who showed up at Edward's office that day, expecting an easy path because of family ties, only to be blindsided and cast aside. That boy deserved better. And so did the people I led. One morning, as the sun spilled through my office window, I found a note on my desk. It was from Reggie, the intern I had mentored closely. "Thank you for believing in me when no one else did. You showed me that where I come from doesn't determine where I'm going." The words struck a chord deeper than any corporate win. It was proof that the ripples of change I hoped to make were already taking hold. Reflecting on the journey, I saw how far I had come. From the bitterness of being fired to the quiet satisfaction of building something meaningful. I no longer cared about proving I was better than Edward or anyone else. The victory was in breaking cycles, opening doors, and becoming a leader who lifted others up. And yet, the story wasn't over. I still had to reconcile with Edward, not just as business rivals or family, but as men who had both been shaped by pride and fear. One afternoon, he invited me over for dinner. It felt like a gesture toward peace, and I accepted. The evening was filled with awkward pauses and polite conversation until Edward finally spoke candidly. "When I fired you, Carter, I thought I was teaching you respect, how to survive in this world." He sighed deeply. "But the truth is, I was scared. Scared you'd outshine me, that you'd challenge everything I built." I listened without interruption. "I was wrong," he admitted. "You didn't just survive, you thrived. And maybe it's time I learned a thing or two from you." His words lifted a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. That night, as I drove home, I thought about the journey, the betrayals, the struggles, the triumphs, and realized that true respect isn't demanded. It's earned through perseverance, humility, and grace. I placed a sticky note on my monitor back at the office. Build a legacy that breaks cycles, not just profits. It was a daily reminder that my mission was bigger than business. It was about changing lives, starting with my own. The days that followed the dinner with Edward marked a subtle but profound shift in my life. The heavy weight of our long-standing rivalry began to ease, replaced by a cautious but genuine hope for something new between us. It was not a sudden, dramatic reconciliation. We weren't best friends overnight, nor did all old grievances vanish in an instant. Instead, it was a fragile truce, born out of a recognition that despite all our differences and past conflicts, we shared something no one else did: a complicated family bond and a history intertwined by business and blood. Walking into the office after that evening, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. Acquiring Novalink had initially been about one thing: beating Edward at his own game and proving my worth. But now, it was becoming about something bigger: creating a lasting legacy, a company culture that honored not just profits, but people, innovation, and integrity. I realized the true power of business was not in competition alone, but in collaboration, in forging alliances rather than enemies. To begin this new chapter, I decided to extend an olive branch beyond the walls of our own company. For years, Edward's business had operated within a closed circle. Rival companies eyed each other warily, and cooperation was nearly unheard of. I wanted to change that narrative. I started reaching out to former competitors, industry veterans, and even some of Edward's old business partners. My goal wasn't just to negotiate deals, but to build a network of trust, exchange ideas, and learn from those I had once viewed as threats. The first few invitations I sent out were met with skepticism. I won't lie. Some declined outright, unwilling to engage with someone tied so closely to the old guard they distrusted. But many accepted, intrigued by the prospect of shaking up the industry dynamics. I organized a series of informal gatherings: coffee, meetups, casual lunches, after-hours brainstorming sessions, where barriers melted away and honest conversations could happen. These were not stiff, formal meetings filled with guarded posturing, but genuine exchanges of ideas, challenges, and visions for the future. At one such meeting, I met Elena, a dynamic CEO leading a mid-sized tech company that specialized in sustainable innovations. Her energy was infectious, and her forward-thinking approach perfectly complemented the direction I wanted Novalink to take. We spent hours discussing market trends, the potential for green technology in our industry, and the importance of ethical business practices. It wasn't long before Elena and I agreed to collaborate on a pilot project, a partnership that would expand Novalink's reach into sustainable markets and enhance our competitive edge. Building these new alliances forced me to confront my own limitations and prejudices. I had to admit that I didn't have all the answers, and that sometimes the best way to lead was to listen. Really listen. There were moments when my proposals were challenged or dismissed, and it stung more than I expected. But I learned to separate my ego from the company's goals. I accepted that a good leader isn't the one who always knows best, but the one who brings out the best in others. Sarah's role in this transformation was indispensable. She was not only my wife, but my confidant and strategic partner. With her deep knowledge of both companies and her passion for innovation, she became the voice of reason and the spark for many of our most creative ideas. We spent countless nights huddled over spreadsheets and strategy plans, pushing each other to think bigger and bolder. Our shared vision gave us a sense of unity and strength that was contagious throughout the organization. Despite these positive changes, old tensions didn't disappear overnight. Edward was still involved in board meetings and sometimes openly questioned decisions I made, skeptical of the new direction. Some longtime board members and senior staff resisted the changes, clinging to familiar routines and fearful of the unknown. Navigating these internal politics required patience, tact, and constant communication. I made a point to meet with dissenters personally, listening to their concerns, acknowledging their fears, and showing them how our new path could secure the company's future. One afternoon, during a particularly intense strategy session with Elena and my leadership team, she said something that resonated deeply. Leadership isn't just about steering the ship. Sometimes it's about knowing when to change course. Her words reminded me that adaptability was key, that rigidity could sink even the most promising ventures. Encouraged by that insight, I fostered a culture where innovation was celebrated and failure seen as a stepping stone, not a setback. We held regular idea forums where employees at all levels could pitch projects, voice concerns, or suggest improvements. The energy in the office shifted palpably as people felt empowered to contribute beyond their job descriptions. Financially, the results began to show. Novalink's revenue grew steadily, fueled not only by the new partnerships, but by renewed client trust and loyalty. But the most meaningful metrics were the intangible ones: the rise in employee engagement scores, the smiles in the hallways, and the pride people took in their work. One of the most powerful moments came when I shared my story of being fired by Edward with the leadership team during a company retreat. I wasn't seeking sympathy. I wanted to demonstrate the power of resilience and the importance of owning your journey, no matter how painful. The response was profound. Several team members shared their own struggles with rejection, failure, or difficult family dynamics. Together, we acknowledged that behind every professional title was a human story filled with setbacks and triumphs. Standing before them that morning, I felt a profound connection, a reminder that leadership was less about authority and more about service. It wasn't just about building a successful company. It was about nurturing a community that could weather storms and celebrate victories together. The future was still uncertain. Challenges awaited on every horizon, from market fluctuations to the ever-present shadow of the past. But for the first time, I faced those uncertainties with confidence and grace, supported by a team that believed not only in the business, but in each other. After the initial wave of new partnerships and the hopeful thaw between Edward and me, the real work began. Rebuilding trust within Novalink and winning back the clients who had grown wary during the years of turmoil. Acquiring a company is one thing. Turning it into a unified, thriving force is an entirely different challenge. When I stepped into the leadership role, the staff at Novalink were visibly divided. Some were loyal to Edward, others to me, and many simply exhausted from the tension and uncertainty. The atmosphere was thick with skepticism, and morale was dangerously low. Employees whispered doubts behind closed doors, worried about layoffs, shifts in corporate culture, and whether their efforts would be recognized. I understood their fears because, in many ways, I shared them. The day I was fired from Edwards' company replayed in my mind more times than I could count. I remembered the sting of betrayal, the embarrassment of being dismissed by my own father-in-law, and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. Yet, those memories fueled a deep determination to do better, not just for myself, but for everyone who depended on this business. To start, I made a point to be transparent. I called a company-wide meeting, gathering everyone in the main conference hall. Instead of presenting a glossy vision with empty promises, I spoke honestly about the struggles we had faced, the mistakes I had made, and the road ahead. I acknowledged the pain the family feud had caused, not just in our personal lives, but in our professional environment. Most importantly, I pledged to work alongside the team, not above them, to rebuild a company culture rooted in respect and collaboration. That meeting marked the beginning of a new chapter. I introduced an open-door policy where any employee could share concerns or ideas directly with me or senior management. I also implemented regular feedback sessions, making it clear that every voice mattered. The process was slow at first. Trust doesn't grow overnight, but little by little, walls began to come down. One of my biggest priorities was reconnecting with our clients. Many had been caught in the crossfire of our family drama, uncertain about the stability and future of Novalink. I personally reached out to our top clients, inviting them for face-to-face meetings. I listened carefully to their concerns, assured them of our commitment to quality and service, and shared our new strategic vision. During one of these meetings, a longtime client named Marcus confessed, "We almost took our business elsewhere last year. We weren't sure if Novalink could stay steady with all the changes, but hearing your plan and knowing you're personally invested makes us want to stick around. Hearing that was a turning point. I realized that trust wasn't something I could command. It had to be earned through consistent action and genuine care. At the same time, I focused on empowering our leadership team. I wanted them to feel ownership over their departments and to become advocates for the change we needed. I encouraged cross-department collaboration, breaking down silos that had formed over the years. By hosting team-building retreats, workshops, and brainstorming sessions, we fostered a spirit of unity that hadn't existed before. Sarah's influence continued to be a cornerstone during this period. She helped design training programs that sharpened skills while promoting Novalink's core values. Together, we launched an employee recognition initiative that celebrated hard work, innovation, and teamwork. Simple gestures like these helped rebuild a sense of pride and belonging. Of course, not everyone was on board. There were some who resisted change outright, clinging to old habits and resentments. I had to make difficult decisions, letting go of toxic elements that threatened to undermine progress. It was painful but necessary. Creating a healthy environment meant protecting the company's future, even if it meant parting ways with some familiar faces. Outside the company, the market was evolving rapidly. New competitors emerged, technologies advanced, and client expectations shifted. Novalink needed to adapt or risk falling behind. The partnerships I'd forged earlier with Elena and other industry leaders became invaluable resources. We shared insights, explored joint ventures, and invested in research and development. Together, we developed new products tailored to emerging demands, smarter, more sustainable, and user-friendly. Our marketing campaigns pivoted to highlight innovation and reliability, rebuilding Novalink's reputation from the ground up. One of the proudest moments came when we secured a contract with a major international client. This deal was a testament to how far we'd come, from a fractured company overshadowed by internal strife to a rising star in the industry. Throughout this period, I remained mindful of the delicate family dynamics. Edward and I maintained a professional distance, focusing on our roles within the company. Occasionally, we shared updates or discussed strategic moves, but the past grievances lingered beneath the surface. I learned to compartmentalize, keeping personal feelings separate from business decisions. I often thought back to that harsh day when Edward fired me. At the time, it felt like the end of the world. But now it was clear that moment was a catalyst for transformation, a painful push that forced me to grow, to fight for respect on my own terms, and ultimately, to build something stronger. Looking ahead, I knew there would be more challenges, but with a team united by trust, a market responding to our innovations, and a clear vision guiding us forward, I was ready to face whatever came next. Just as I began to feel that Novalink was truly on the path to recovery, an unexpected twist came that would change everything. It came in the form of an unlikely ally, Marcus Reed, a former competitor who I had tangled with during my early days in the industry. Marcus wasn't just any rival. For years, our companies had fought tooth and nail over contracts, clients, and market share. Our rivalry was well known in the industry. When I was fired from Edward's company and started rebuilding Novalink, Marcus was among the first to dismiss me, assuming I was finished for good. So when Marcus unexpectedly reached out, I was skeptical. At first, I thought it was a trick, maybe an attempt to gain some inside information. But as our conversations deepened, it became clear he genuinely wanted to collaborate. He explained that while competition had been fierce, the market had shifted. Industry giants were consolidating, smaller players were struggling, and neither of us could survive alone in the long term. He saw the potential for a strategic partnership between us that could benefit both companies. I was cautious. Our history ran deep, and trust didn't come easily. But I also recognized that to move forward, I needed to put pride aside and embrace new possibilities. We arranged a meeting at a neutral location, a quiet cafe halfway between our headquarters. That meeting turned into a marathon discussion that lasted hours. We laid out our visions, challenges, and what we hoped to achieve. For the first time, Marcus and I saw each other not as adversaries, but as partners who could create something bigger, together. Over the next several months, we explored joint ventures, cross-promoted services, and shared resources. Our collaboration breathed new life into Novalink's offerings, expanding our reach and capabilities. Marcus's company had strengths we lacked, and vice versa. Together, we filled gaps and created a more comprehensive, competitive package. This alliance sent a clear message to the industry. Novalink was back, stronger and smarter. Clients who had once wavered were reassured by the stability and expanded expertise. Employees felt renewed energy, motivated by the prospect of growth and innovation. Of course, this partnership wasn't without challenges. We had to navigate cultural differences between the two companies, align goals, and build trust across teams who had long been competitors. There were moments of friction and setbacks, but the shared commitment kept us on course. One memorable incident involved a project where both companies were tasked with delivering an integrated solution for a large client. Miscommunications led to delays and frustration on both sides. Rather than pointing fingers, Marcus and I took personal responsibility. We facilitated open dialogue, clarified expectations, and jointly developed a revised plan that satisfied the client. That experience deepened our partnership. It reminded me that business isn't just about transactions, but about relationships, built on respect, accountability, and a willingness to learn from mistakes. The alliance also had a surprising impact on Edward. He observed from the sidelines, and while he never fully warmed up to the idea, I noticed a subtle shift in his attitude. Perhaps he recognized that my approach was effective in ways his rigid methods weren't. Our interactions became less tense, more professional. Through Marcus, I also gained valuable insights into navigating the wider industry landscape. He introduced me to influential leaders, helped me understand emerging trends, and encouraged me to think beyond traditional boundaries. Meanwhile, at Novalink, the infusion of new ideas and resources sparked a wave of creativity. We launched a series of innovative products that combined the best of both companies' technologies. Marketing campaigns emphasized our collaborative spirit and commitment to excellence, resonating strongly with existing and potential clients. One particular product launch stood out. It was a cutting-edge software platform designed to streamline workflow and enhance customer experience. The launch event was a resounding success, attracting media attention and new business inquiries. As Novalink grew, so did my confidence as a leader. I embraced a leadership style rooted in openness, empathy, and strategic thinking. Qualities I had cultivated through my trials and the lessons learned from past mistakes. I also made sure to nurture the next generation of leaders within the company. Mentoring promising employees, encouraging innovation, and fostering a culture of continuous learning became top priorities. I wanted Novalink to be not just a business, but a community where people could grow and thrive. Reflecting on this phase of the journey, I realized that the fire Edward had lit by firing me, intended to teach me respect, had inadvertently sparked something far greater. It had pushed me to evolve, to forge new alliances, and ultimately, to lead with a vision that extended beyond personal grievances. While the past could never be erased, I had transformed it into fuel for progress. Novalink was no longer just Edward's company or my second chance. It was a new entity built on resilience, collaboration, and a relentless drive to succeed. The turning point came not in a boardroom or during a high-profile product launch, but at an industry summit, an event where Edward used to be the main keynote speaker every year. It was the kind of gathering where legacy leaders flexed their influence, emerging entrepreneurs networked furiously, and companies fought for visibility. It was also the first time Novalink was invited back to attend in a decade. The invitation felt symbolic, a recognition of how far we'd come. But what I didn't expect was what came next. I wasn't just invited to attend. I was asked to deliver the closing keynote speech. I sat with the email open on my laptop for several minutes, unsure whether to laugh, cry, or just stare. The boy who once fumbled through presentations at Edward's dinner table, the man who had been publicly humiliated and cast aside as a lesson in respect, was now being honored as a thought leader. I accepted the invitation but kept the news quiet, only informing my executive team. I didn't want a big fuss. I wanted the speech to speak for itself. As the day of the summit arrived, the venue buzzed with anticipation. Leaders from every corner of the industry filled the ballroom. Some I had worked with, some had written me off during my fall from grace. Among the crowd, I spotted Marcus nodding at me in support, and beside him, some familiar faces from Edward's old executive circle. Edward himself was there. I hadn't seen him in person in months, but he looked older, not just in age but in energy, like someone still fighting to keep up with a game that had changed while he refused to. I stepped onto the stage. The lights were bright, the room hushed, and all eyes were on me. But this time, I didn't feel intimidated. I felt empowered. I began not with numbers, not with technology, but with the story. My story. I walked the audience through the years of sacrifice, humiliation, rebuilding. I talked about the pain of losing everything and the clarity that followed. I shared how the lessons I learned about leadership, humility, collaboration had not only shaped me, but Novalink's rebirth. And then I turned to the future. The four. Real success, I said, isn't about how much we dominate a market or how many clients we win. It's about how many people we bring with us on the journey. It's about creating companies that serve, uplift, and inspire. The room erupted, in applause, not polite applause, genuine, long, emotional applause. Afterward, I stepped off stage, and within seconds, people surrounded me. Executives offering partnerships, young entrepreneurs wanting advice, media personnel requesting interviews. I was no longer the fallen son-in-law. I was a leader in my own right. Later, while grabbing a drink at the reception area, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned. It was Edward. We stood in silence for a moment before he finally spoke. "You did good up there," he said, voice low, his eyes scanning the room. "Better than I expected." "Thanks," I replied cautiously. "I won't pretend I handled everything right," he continued. "I thought firing you would make you stronger, tougher. In my day, that's how we learned. But maybe I went too far." It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was the closest thing to one I was ever going to get. And strangely, I didn't need more. "I appreciate that," I said simply. He glanced around again. "Novalink, you really turned it around." "We did," I said. "Not just me. A lot of good people believed in the vision." He nodded. "I see that now." Then, with a final nod, he walked away. I watched him go, not with bitterness, but with peace. In that moment, I realized something important. This wasn't just my redemption arc. It was the closing of a long, painful chapter. In the weeks following the summit, Novalink's momentum skyrocketed. New clients poured in. A major magazine featured us as one of the top 10 companies to watch. We expanded our operations internationally, opening a satellite office in Singapore. Our team grew by 60% over the next quarter. And yet, despite the growth, I stayed rooted in the same principles that carried me through the hardest days: integrity, mentorship, resilience, and trust. I launched an internal leadership development program to help employees not just climb the ladder, but understand the responsibility that came with leadership. I partnered with a nonprofit to support young professionals who had been overlooked or underestimated, just like I once was. Every Friday, I carved out an hour to walk the halls of the company and talk to people, not as their CEO, but as a colleague. I'd ask how they were doing, what challenges they were facing, and what ideas they had for Novalink's future. Because if there was one thing I'd learned, it was this: building something that lasts isn't about proving others wrong. It's about becoming someone you're proud of, no matter who's watching. I didn't buy Edward's biggest competitor just to teach him a lesson. I did it because I believed we could do better for our clients, for our people, and for the future. But perhaps the most poetic moment came a month later when I was invited back to the very house I'd once been kicked out of. My wife's family was celebrating her mother's 70th birthday, and the whole family would be there. I was hesitant. The memories in that house ran deep, and not all of them were good. But when I walked in, Edward met me at the door. "Welcome back, son," he said, and for the first time I believed he meant it. The strange thing about success is how quiet it feels once you finally reach the mountaintop. You expect trumpets, celebrations, and fireworks, but in reality, it's often just a deep breath, a quiet moment of reflection, and the unmistakable peace of knowing you did the impossible. In the months after that summit, Novalink had become more than a rising star. It had become the standard. Publications began calling us the blueprint for modern leadership. Competitors started mimicking our operational models. Universities reached out to collaborate on entrepreneurship programs. It was surreal, humbling, powerful. But more than the accolades, I found myself cherishing the little things, like hearing junior developers excitedly pitch ideas at team meetings, or watching our HR director implement mental health initiatives I'd once only dreamed of during sleepless nights rebuilding from scratch, or mentoring a bright, eager intern who reminded me so much of who I used to be. One afternoon, after a quarterly board meeting, I found myself walking alone through the office. The halls were quieter than usual. Most of the team was out celebrating the launch of our new sustainability initiative, and I'd chosen to stay behind for a moment of quiet. I passed by the original Novalink mission statement we had printed and framed years ago. It read, "We exist to serve people first, through innovation, through integrity, and through impact. Because greatness isn't built by power, it's built by people." My throat tightened. That one sentence had carried us through the darkest storms. It reminded me why I didn't give up when I was humiliated, why I didn't retaliate when I was fired, why I kept going when the odds made it look laughable to try. As I stood there, I heard the elevator ding softly. I turned to see Emily, my wife, stepping out. She was holding our daughter in her arms, toddler curls bouncing as she squirmed in excitement. "I figured we'd surprise you," Emily said, smiling. "We just came from visiting your parents' old house. I wanted to show her the roots." My heart ached and swelled at the same time. Emily had stood by me through every moment, never once questioning my vision, even when it meant moving to a smaller home, selling her jewelry, or hearing her own father tear me apart. She had been my anchor, and now we were building a life that would redefine everything for our daughter. I picked up my little girl and gave her a kiss on the forehead. She giggled, gripping my tie and babbling nonsense. "One day," I said to her softly, "you'll hear a lot of things from a lot of people, about what you can or can't do, about who you are or who you're not. But just remember, none of that matters unless you believe it." Emily smiled, and we walked together into my office, which overlooked the skyline of the very city that had once laughed at the name Novalink. A few weeks later, an unexpected letter arrived in the mail. Handwritten, elegant stationery. I opened it slowly and read the first few words. "To my son-in-law, It was from Edward. He thanked me, not just for what I had built, but for showing him that leadership was more than authority. He confessed that watching me succeed had forced him to confront his own mistakes, his pride, and even his fears. It was the first time I had ever heard him say he respected me. Not because I beat him, but because I didn't let bitterness own me. The letter ended with an offer. Not of business, not of shares, but of mentorship for the next generation of leaders. He wanted to collaborate on a nonprofit foundation that could train young entrepreneurs from underrepresented communities. He wanted to partner with me. I laughed as I put the letter down. It was full circle now. What had started as a lesson to teach me respect had turned into the very thing that earned me more respect than Edward could ever have imagined. We named the foundation the Bridge Initiative, a nod to the journey of building bridges where walls once stood. Edward took on a symbolic role, mostly offering insights from decades of experience. I focused on the mentorship track and brought in my team to lead workshops and startup funding rounds. By the end of the year, over 300 young founders had gone through the program. Many of them were launching their first businesses. A few had already secured seed funding. And some, I had no doubt, would eventually build something that put both Novalink and Edward's old firm to shame. And I welcomed that, because that's what real leadership looks like. Lifting others higher than you climbed. Investing in the very people they said didn't deserve a seat at the table. And as for Novalink, we kept building. We launched a new AI division focused on education accessibility. We expanded our community outreach arm, and we started documenting our journey, not as a victory lap, but as a roadmap for those who thought they'd never be given a chance. I didn't just buy Edward's biggest competitor. I became the competitor others would one day try to buy, not out of revenge, out of vision, out of purpose, out of the unshakable belief that when you stay true to who you are, no amount of rejection can ever stop what you're meant to become. This wasn't a story about payback. It was a story about transformation. Mine, theirs, and maybe yours too. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.